first up, we're looking at the institutions designed to keep government accountable. The specific focus here is the role of the CAG as the highest auditing authority is intrinsically linked to increasing the effectiveness of government policies and undertakings. In this context, examine how independent and efficient working of the CAG can ensure good governance.
Okay, the CAG. That's the Comptroller and Auditor General. It's established right there in the Constitution, Article 148. Think of it as the ultimate financial watchdog for the government.
Watchdog, okay. So what does it actually do?
It performs two main kinds of audits. First, there's the regulatory audit. This basically checks, did the government follow all the financial rules and procedures? Was the spending properly sanctioned?
Right, like checking the receipts.
Sort of, yeah. And then, arguably more impactful, is the performance audit. This asks, did the government spend the money wisely? Was the spending economical? Was it efficient? And crucially, was it effective in achieving the stated goals?
Okay, so it's not just about ticking boxes, but about results, too. How does its independence help ensure good governance, then? You mentioned transparency.
Absolutely. Transparency is key. Because the CAG is independent, it can report findings without, theoretically, political pressure. A really good example of this in action was when the CAG pointed out a huge increase in what's called off-budget borrowings.
Off-budget borrowings, what's that?
It's essentially when the government incurs liabilities or borrows money in ways that don't show up on the main official budget documents. It can kind of obscure the true extent of government debt.
Ah, I see. So the CAG flagged this.
Yes, they highlighted the scale of it, brought it out of the open, and that public exposure led the government to curtail the practice significantly. That's transparency forcing accountability. That's good governance right there.
Makes sense. And what about the other side, efficiency and trust?
Well, the CAG's work definitely pushes for greater efficiency. By pointing out wasteful expenditure, it reduces opportunity costs. Money wasted on one thing could have been used better elsewhere. And it builds public trust.
I suppose the big scandals helped with that.
Undoubtedly. Many people became aware of the CAG because of the reports on things like the Commonwealth game spending and the 2D spectrum allocation brought forward by the former CAG, Vinod Rai. Those reports really shook things up.
So it acts as the watchdog of the public purse, as they say.
That's the phrase. And in doing so, it strengthens democracy. Even its reports on things like how central cess collections are used can strengthen federalism because it gives states data to ask questions about their share.
Okay, it sounds powerful. But you mentioned constraints earlier. What are the main challenges it faces?
Well, the biggest one is that the CAG performs a postmortem analysis. It audits expenditure after the money has already been spent.
So it can't stop a bad decision before it happens.
Exactly. It can only report on it afterwards, which is crucial for learning and accountability, but it doesn't prevent the initial waste or misuse.
Right. And what about its independence in practice?
That's the other point. While constitutionally independent, the CAG is appointed by the government of the day. Naturally, questions sometimes arise about whether that appointment process could, potentially, influence the institution's absolute neutrality down the line. It's a structural challenge.
Okay, understood. That actually leads us quite neatly into our second topic, which looks at partnerships beyond the government itself. The question is, sustainable alliance between non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and the state is critical for social change and development. Highlighting hurdles in this developmental alliance suggest remedial measures for a more productive partnership.
Right, NGOs. These are private, voluntary groups working on social causes. Think of organizations like Bachpen Bachao Andolan working on child rights. They are absolutely vital players in development.
Why is the alliance with the state so critical?
Because the scale of the challenges, especially meeting things like the Sustainable Development Goals, is just too vast for the government or NGOs to tackle alone. Deeper engagement, real partnership is needed. But as the source material makes very clear, this relationship is often, well, quite rocky.
Rocky, okay. What are the main hurdles? What gets in the way of this alliance working smoothly?
Probably the biggest one is a significant trust deficit. There's often suspicion between the government and NGOs. We've seen this manifest in the tightening of FCRA norms.
Sorry, FCRA norms. Can you remind us what they are?
Yes. That's the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. It governs how NGOs can receive funding from outside India. The government has made these rules stricter, which has really impacted the funding and operations of many NGOs, even perfectly legitimate ones. This fuels a sense of mistrust on both sides.
Okay, trust deficit is number one. What else?
Second, sometimes NGOs, even with good intentions, can be seen as barriers to development projects. The example often cited is Amnesty International's campaign regarding the Kudankulam nuclear power plant. They raised environmental and safety concerns, which are valid points for discussion, but from the government's perspective, it can be seen as hindering a major infrastructure project.
So perception matters a lot here.
Hugely.
Okay.
And then third, we can't ignore the issue that sometimes the NGO structure has unfortunately been misused for illicit activities. The sources mention concerns about things like forced conversions being carried out under the guise of NGO work. This obviously tars legitimate organizations with the same brush.
That definitely complicates the picture for everyone.
It does.
Eh?
And finally, there's sometimes just plain non-cooperation. An example given is Greenpeace filing public interest litigations, PILs, against land acquisition for certain projects. Again, they might be raising valid legal or environmental points, but it creates an adversarial relationship rather than a collaborative one.
It sounds like a really complex and often tense relationship. If we want better development outcomes, what are the suggested fixes? How can this partnership be made more productive?
The sources suggest several practical steps. We need a proper, formal platform for regular dialogue between the government and NGOs. We need to streamline the funding processes, maybe reduce some of the bureaucratic red tape associated with compliance.
Like that FCRA issue you mentioned.
Exactly. Perhaps something like a single window engagement mechanism where NGOs can deal with regulatory requirements more easily could help build trust and efficiency.
Makes sense.
And crucially, the suggestion is to give NGOs meaningful representation in relevant policy committees. This would allow them to bring their ground-level experience and insights directly into the policymaking process, ensuring that policies are better designed to reflect realities on the ground.
Right, getting that practical knowledge into the room. Okay, let's pivot now to a really hot topic, something that connects development, politics, and money. Topic 3. Subsidies have morphed into a populist tool to achieve electoral objectives rather than developmental goals. Examine.
Subsidies. This is a big one. Originally, subsidies had clear developmental purposes, right? Things like ensuring food security through subsidized grains, helping vulnerable groups like women and children with schemes like the Ujjwal Yoshana for cooking gas, or ensuring equitable access to public goods like education or healthcare.
That was the idea, yes, but the statement suggests they've morphed, changed their purpose. How?
Well, the argument, strongly supported by the source material, is that subsidies are increasingly being designed and deployed specifically to influence voters, often just before elections, rather than primarily targeting long-term development needs.
Can you give some concrete examples of this shift towards populism?
The clearest examples are things like offering free electricity or free water, often without proper targeting. This means even well-off sections of the population who could easily afford to pay end up benefiting.
So it's not based on need anymore.
Increasingly less so in these populist schemes. You also see this competitive element in election manifestos. Party X promises, say, 200 units of free electricity, so Party Y, immediately counters by offering 250 units. It becomes an auction to win votes.
Right, disconnected from actual development impact.
Exactly. And then you have outright freebies, like distributing televisions or other consumer goods. These have virtually no direct relationship to developmental goals like improving health, education, or infrastructure. They are purely about attracting voters.
And this isn't just about wasting money, is it? There are other consequences.
Absolutely. There are significant economic distortions and environmental costs. The example given of the massive electricity subsidy in Punjab is stark. It has directly contributed to severe groundwater depletion because it incentivizes farmers to pump huge amounts of water, essentially for free, regardless of the environmental impact.
So what's the conclusion here? How do we fix this?
The consensus seems to be that subsidies, if used, need much proper targeting to ensure they reach those genuinely in need and serve actual developmental goals. And critically, the Election Commission needs adequate powers to scrutinize and potentially regulate these kinds of populist promises and manifestos that lack clear developmental rationale or funding plans.
Giving the Election Commission more teeth, essentially. Okay. Now let's turn our attention to protecting a specific vulnerable population. Topic 4. National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, NCST, can be most effective when its tasks are adequately supported by other mechanisms that improve the voice of the tribals. Discuss.
All right, the NCST. Scheduled tribes make up around 8% of India's population, and they face disproportionate challenges, including significantly higher infant mortality rates, IMR, and maternal mortality rates, MMR, compared to the general population.
And the NCST's role.
It's established under Article 338A of the Constitution. Its mandate is to oversee the implementation of safeguards for STs, inquire into specific complaints regarding the deprivation of their rights, and advise on their socioeconomic development.
Okay, so the commission exists, but the question implies it needs support from other mechanisms to be truly effective. Why isn't the NCST enough on its own? What's missing?
The sources argue that the NCST, while important, operates somewhat in isolation and lacks the necessary clout or supporting infrastructure. To be truly effective, it needs to be bolstered by several other mechanisms. Well, first, the health statistics are shocking. The suggestion is for a dedicated focus, perhaps even a separate health department or initiative, specifically targeting diseases that are unusually prevalent in tribal communities. The sources highlight that tuberculosis and malaria alone account for a staggering 50% of tribal deaths. That needs a specialized, targeted health intervention beyond what the NCST can directly provide.
Wow, 50%. That's huge. What else?
Second, improving the political representation and voice of tribal communities is crucial. They need platforms and mechanisms to effectively articulate their concerns and participate in mainstream political discourse, ensuring their issues aren't sidelined.
And cultural preservation.
Yes, that's the third point. Stronger institutional mechanisms for preserving tribal culture and languages are needed, including better documentation and support for traditional knowledge systems. The NCST can advocate for this, but needs partnerships to implement it effectively.
So it sounds like the core issue is that the NCST can recommend but can't necessarily make things happen.
That's precisely the core problem highlighted. The NCST ultimately has no real power to enforce its findings or recommendations. It can investigate, it can report, it can advise, but it cannot compel government departments or state governments to act.
So it lacks teeth, just like the Election Commission with the Model Code of Conduct.
In a way, yes. The recommendation arising from this is the need for a more holistic tribal development plan, one that integrates efforts across various ministries and departments with clear accountability rather than relying solely on the commission.
Okay, this idea of institutional weakness or lack of enforcement power leads us directly into the next question, which is quite provocative. Topic 5. Normalization of poverty as a feature of a large population overshadows the lack of intent and capacity of political and administrative institutions. Do you agree? Justify using suitable examples.
This is a really fundamental question about how we perceive and tackle poverty. Poverty itself, simply put, is the denial of choice and opportunity. Now, historically, especially in India, there's been a tendency to attribute the persistence of poverty partly to the sheer size of the population, the idea that growth gets diluted.
The too many mouths to feed argument, essentially.
Exactly. But the statement here argues, and I would agree, that this normalization, this acceptance of poverty as almost inevitable in a large country, conveniently overshadows the real problem, the failures of our institutions, both political and administrative.
So you agree that institutional failure is the bigger driver?
I do, because accepting poverty as normal lets institutions off the hook. It masks a lack of political will, ineffective implementation, and sometimes outright lack of capacity.
What's the strongest argument against the large population excuse?
The most powerful counterexample is China. Since its economic reforms began, China has lifted an estimated 850 million people out of extreme poverty. It also has a massive population. This demonstrates that large population size is not an insurmountable barrier if there is sufficient institutional focus, capacity, and political will.
So how do India's institutions fall short, according to the sources?
Several ways. One is setting low minimum standards. For example, our public distribution system, PDS, has often been criticized for being cereal-centric, providing calories but not necessarily adequate nutrition. Similarly, many government skill development programs focus on imparting only very basic low-skilled job training, which doesn't offer a real pathway out of poverty.
And what about lack of intent or capacity in implementation?
This is where you see major problems like leakages and scams in welfare programs. The sources mention examples like investigations revealing false beneficiaries, claiming benefits under the Janani Suraksha Yojana, maternal health scheme, or historical examples like the fodder scam.
Right, corruption undermining the goals.
Precisely. You also see institutions that are simply overworked and under-resourced, leading them to treat welfare distribution more like charity than a citizen's right. And there's the issue of misallocation of funds. Often funds are tied rigidly to specific central schemes, tied funds, preventing local bodies from using the money flexibly to address specific local needs. All these point towards institutional shortcomings rather than just population size.
A very compelling argument. Now let's address a particularly distressing social issue. Topic 6. While manual scavenging is legally banned, socioeconomic realities perpetuate this practice in society. Comment. Suggest measures to deal with the menace of this social evil.
Yes, manual scavenging, the practice of manually cleaning, carrying, or disposing of human excreta from dry latrines or sewers, is indeed legally prohibited in India under the Prohibition of Employment as Manual Scavengers and their Rehabilitation Act, 2013.
Legally banned, yet it persists. Why? The question points to socioeconomic realities.
Exactly. The persistence of this horrific practice is deeply, tragically intertwined with India's socioeconomic fabric, particularly the caste system. Overwhelmingly, the individuals forced into manual scavenging belong to the lowest caste hierarchies, historically considered untouchable.
So it's directly linked to caste discrimination.
Absolutely. This is not just a job. It's a manifestation of deeply entrenched social prejudice. These individuals often suffer from generations of disadvantage, low literacy levels, poor human capital development, and a complete lack of access to social security or alternative opportunities.
Which creates a trap, I imagine.
A vicious cycle. Crucially, due to the extreme social stigma and lack of skills or opportunities, manual scavenging is often the only form of employment they can find to survive. They are ostracized from other jobs, forcing them back into this degrading and dangerous work.
It's truly awful. What measures are suggested to actually deal with this menace? How can we break this cycle?
The approach needs to be two-pronged: immediate measures and long-term solutions.
Okay, what are the immediate steps?
Immediately, there needs to be strict enforcement of the law, including heavy penalties for employing manual scavengers. Critically, there must be widespread deployment of machines for cleaning sewers and septic tanks. The Kerala model, where robotics are being used for this purpose, is often cited as a positive example. There should also be provision of immediate financial allowances or support for those rescued from manual scavenging.
Replacing human labor with technology and the long-term strategy.
Long-term, The focus must be on genuine rehabilitation. This means targeted upskilling and vocational training programs to provide viable alternative livelihoods. It requires sustained awareness generation campaigns to combat the social stigma associated with these communities. And importantly, community-based rehabilitation programs that involve the affected individuals in designing and implementing solutions, ensuring they are not just given handouts, but empowered to build new lives. Breaking the link to caste is paramount here.
A comprehensive approach is clearly needed. Okay, that concludes our look at domestic governance and social policy for now. Let's shift gears dramatically and move into the realm of international relations and foreign policy. We start with a very current and critical issue. Topic 7. India's response to the Ukraine crisis is an expression of strategic autonomy and not a reflection of strategic compulsions. Examine. Just to set the scene, Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and India notably abstained on several UN resolutions condemning the invasion.
Right. India's stance on the Ukraine war has been intensely debated.
Yeah.
Was it driven by necessity strategic compulsions, or was it a deliberate choice based on India's own interest strategic autonomy?
Let's look at the compulsion argument first. Why might some say India had to take the stance it did?
There are strong arguments on the compulsion side. Firstly, India has a very high dependence on Russia for defense equipment also. Estimates suggest around 46% of India's defense imports historically came from Russia. Maintaining that supply chain, especially amidst ongoing border tensions with China, is seen as a compulsion.
So weapons are a big factor. What else?
Geopolitics. There's the need to manage the complex relationship with Russia to prevent a further deepening of the Russia-China-Pakistan axis, which is seen as detrimental to India's interests. And there's the historical factor. Russia has been perceived as an all-weather friend, particularly remembering its support, or at least non-interference, during the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War. These are powerful compulsions.
Okay, those are compelling points for strategic compulsion. So why is the argument for strategic autonomy considered stronger by many, including potentially the sources here?
The autonomy argument rests on the idea that India, despite these pressures, ultimately prioritized its own national interest above aligning completely with either side. The most prominent example is India's decision to continue and even increase its import of cheaper Russian oil, despite Western sanctions and pressure.
Putting energy security and economic interests first.
Precisely. India essentially framed the conflict as, to some extent, Europe's problem, and asserted its right to manage its own economic needs. Furthermore, India consistently called for dialogue and diplomacy to end the conflict, maintaining a principled stance focused on cessation of hostilities rather than assigning blame in the way Western nations did.
But didn't India condemn some Russian actions?
Yes, and that's a crucial point for the autonomy argument. India, while abstaining at the UN, did express concern over the humanitarian situation, and even went so far as to criticize Russia, specifically following the Bucha massacre, calling for an independent investigation. This wasn't the action of a country acting purely out of compulsion.
So the takeaway is?
The takeaway is that India navigated the crisis by carving out its own position. It refused to simply bandwagon with the West, maintained its crucial relationship with Russia, but also asserted its own principles and economic interests. It's described as an assertive response, characteristic of a power pursuing strategic autonomy, rather than one simply reacting to external pressures.
An independent path, essentially. This idea of influence beyond just military or economic might leads us nicely to our next topic. Topic 8. Comment on the utility and effectiveness of soft power for furthering national interest. Can soft power replace hard power in international politics?
Okay, soft power. This term was famously coined by Joseph Nye. It refers to the ability of a country to influence others and achieve its goals not through coercion, which is hard power like military force or economic sanctions, but through attraction based on its culture, political values, and foreign policies.
So influence through attraction, not force. What's its main utility? Why is it effective?
Its primary utility lies in creating long-lasting influence and goodwill. Unlike hard power, which can breed resentment, soft power fosters deeper connections. Think about the global influence of Japan's culture, captured partly in concepts like the Bushido Code reflecting discipline and quality, which enhances its brand image worldwide. Or more recently, India's Vaccine Maitri initiative during the pandemic, distributing vaccines globally, generated immense goodwill.
And it works in ways hard power can't.
Yes, it often circumvents the limitations of hard power. Hard power involves destruction, instability, and is often ineffective in tackling modern challenges like, say, cyber warfare, which doesn't involve traditional military conflict but creates a sort of frozen war of influence and disruption. Soft power can be more nimble here.
Does it have economic benefits too?
Absolutely. Soft power can open doors for economic opportunities. The term McDonaldization is sometimes used, perhaps critically, to describe how the spread of American culture paved the way for American businesses globally. Cultural exports, tourism, education, these are all facets of soft power with economic dimensions.
Okay, so it's clearly useful, but the second part of the question is critical. Can it replace hard power?
The consensus, and what the sources strongly suggest, is no, it cannot entirely replace hard power.
Why not?
Because hard power, primarily military strength and economic clout, remains essential for deterrence and for protecting national interests when attraction fails or isn't sufficient. Soft power relies on a foundation of security and stability that ultimately is often guaranteed by hard power.
Can you give an example?
Some analysts point to the situation in Ukraine. They argue that Ukraine's decision years ago to give up its nuclear arsenal, a form of hard power, might have inadvertently made it more vulnerable to invasion, regardless of its cultural appeal or democratic values. The swiftness of the invasion highlighted the limits of soft power when faced with military aggression.
So they work together, ideally.
Exactly. Soft power can significantly complement and enhance hard power, making a country's influence more sustainable and palatable. But it can't substitute for the basic requirements of national security and deterrence provided by economic and military strength. It's about smart power, the effective combination of both.
Smart power. Okay, let's apply these ideas to a specific relationship now. Topic 9. India and Japan may have long enjoyed very cordial relations with substantial shared interests, but it also tends to be one that has been low on ambition, limited in outcomes, and high in rhetoric. Critically examine.
Right, the India-Japan relationship. On the surface, it looks very strong. They share democratic values, often called part of the diamond of democracies, along with the US and Australia. They are partners in the G4 group, pushing for UN Security Council reform. They have a shared vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, largely aimed at balancing China, and there are deep cultural ties, primarily through Buddhism.
Sounds like a solid foundation. So why the critique? Why low on ambition, limited in outcomes, high in rhetoric? Let's break that down. First, low ambition, particularly economically.
Yes, despite having a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, CCAP, the bilateral trade volume remains relatively low, certainly lower than potential suggests. A key factor mentioned in the sources is Japan's adherence to a policy often called seikei-bunri.
You mentioned that before. Can you explain it again in this context?
Sure. Seikei-bunri essentially means the separation of politics and economics. For Japan, this means that even if there are political or strategic reasons to align strongly with India against, say, China, Japan might be reluctant to let those political considerations fully dictate its economic relationships or investments, particularly if it disrupts established ties with China. This tends to cap the level of economic ambition in the India-Japan corridor.
Okay, so that limits the ambition. What about limited outcomes? What are the concrete examples of things not quite getting off the ground?
The most high-profile example is the Mumbai-Ahmedabad high-speed rail project, the Bullet Train. It's faced significant delays and challenges. On the defense front, despite a lot of talk about cooperation, there haven't been any truly major defense deals finalized between the two countries. Strategic alignment hasn't translated into big-ticket procurement.
Which leads to the final part of the critique, high in rhetoric.
Exactly. Because the ambition is somewhat capped and concrete outcomes are sometimes limited, the relationship often appears characterized by grand statements and initiatives, like the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, SCRI, or the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, AGC. But the actual progress on these initiatives often seems slow or less impactful than the initial announcements suggest. Lots of talk, less walk, perhaps.
That sounds quite critical, but is there a major positive that balances this picture?
Yes, there's one absolutely critical benefit for India that needs to be highlighted. India is the largest recipient of Japanese overseas development assistance, ODA basically, low-interest loans and grants for infrastructure and development projects. This financial support from Japan is hugely significant for India's development. So despite the critiques, the ODA aspect keeps the relationship fundamentally important.
Okay, a very important nuance there. Let's shift geography completely now to another vital region for India. Topic 10. India's relation with West Asia has acquired depth and diversity that can navigate geopolitical hurdles. Comment.
West Asia, or the Middle East, has always been crucial for India, primarily due to energy. India is heavily dependent on the region, importing around 80% of its crude oil needs from there.
So traditionally, it was all about oil.
Largely, yes. The relationship was often seen as transactional, focused on energy security and the welfare of the large Indian diaspora there. But the argument now is that the relationship has significantly deepened and diversified beyond just oil, enabling India to better navigate the region's complex geopolitics.
And the region is certainly complex. What are the main geopolitical hurdles India has to deal with there?
It's a minefield. You have the ongoing tensions surrounding the US-Iran nuclear deal impacting regional stability. There's the strategic interference from Pakistan and China trying to gain influence. There's significant internal disunity within the region itself, the Saudi-Iran rivalry, the unresolved Israel-Palestine conflicts, and a direct concern for India, the risk of radicalization in the region potentially influencing Indian youth or security.
That's a lot to navigate. So how has the relationship deepened and diversified to help India manage these hurdles?
The sources point to several key dimensions. First, the human factor. There's a huge Indian expatriate community in the Gulf countries, around 8 million people. They are a vital source of remittances back to India, creating strong people-to-people ties and economic links beyond just government relations.
The diaspora connection. What else?
Second, investments in trade have grown significantly beyond oil. There's increasing cooperation in areas like food security, technology, and infrastructure. A key example is the UAE committing to invest $7 billion in food corridors in India, linking Indian farms to Gulf consumers. This diversifies the economic relationship massively.
And strategically, has India's role changed?
Yes, thirdly, strategic ties have strengthened considerably. A major development is the emergence of new multilateral groupings, like the I2U2, which brings together India, Israel, the UAE, and the US. This signals a new era of pragmatic cooperation, even between countries that had historical friction, like Israel and the UAE.
Interesting. I2U2.
And importantly, India is increasingly being acknowledged by regional powers as a net security provider in the wider Indian Ocean region. This means India is seen as a stabilizing force, capable of contributing to maritime security, counter-piracy, and disaster relief, giving it greater strategic weight in West Asian calculations. So it's moved well beyond just being an oil buyer.
A much more multifaceted relationship now. Okay, let's bring our focus back home again, looking at a crucial resource for modern governance and economy: data. Topic 11. Harnessing public sector data is vital for informed decision-making. highlight the various bottlenecks in public data sharing, and suggest strategies for unlocking the true value of data.
Right, public sector data. This refers to the vast amounts of data collected by government agencies, everything from anonymized census data, health statistics, transport patterns like vehicle counts, weather data, agricultural information, and so on.
And the idea is this data is incredibly valuable.
Potentially, yes. It's often called the new oil because it can fuel innovation, improve policymaking, enhance service delivery, and create economic value if it can be accessed and utilized effectively. But we are generally quite poor at actually sharing and using this public data.
Okay, so what are the main bottlenecks? Why isn't this data flowing freely and being used?
There are several key barriers. One is simply a lack of adequate planning and infrastructure for data management and sharing across different government departments. Data often sits in silos, in incompatible formats.
Technical hurdles.
Yes, but perhaps the biggest bottleneck highlighted recently is the absence of a comprehensive data protection law in India. The Personal Data Protection Bill was introduced, debated, and then withdrawn. This legal vacuum creates uncertainty and reluctance among departments to share data, fearing privacy violations or misuse.
So the lack of clear rules is a major blocker.
A huge one. Without a law defining rights, responsibilities, and safeguards, especially for anonymized or non-personal data, the default is often not to share. Another issue is a lack of expertise within government departments. Many decision makers are still top-down and not particularly tech-savvy, so they may not fully appreciate the potential value of the data they hold or how to enable its safe use.
Okay, lack of infrastructure, no law, lack of expertise. How do we unlock this potential then? What are the suggested strategies?
First and foremost, we need a clear data sharing policy framework. This needs to be underpinned by robust data protection legislation that clarifies the rules for using both personal and non-personal data.
So get the law sorted out.
Absolutely. Secondly, the Crisco-Palakrishnan Committee specifically recommended encouraging the voluntary sharing of non-personal data. This is anonymized data that doesn't identify individuals, but can reveal trends and patterns valuable for research and innovation. Creating frameworks and platforms for this voluntary sharing is key.
And practical applications.
We need to actively pilot data-based approaches in various sectors. The sources mention examples like precision agriculture, where combining soil data, weather data, and satellite imagery can help farmers make much more informed decisions about planting, irrigation, and fertilization. Or using anonymized public data for market research to help industries, especially small businesses, understand consumer trends. Demonstrating the value through such pilots can build momentum for wider data sharing.
Show, don't just tell. Makes sense. Now let's turn to the very foundation of our democratic process, elections. Topic 12. Examine the significance of the Representation of the People Act, 1951, in maintaining the sanctity of electoral politics in India. In light of recent events, evaluate the demands of the Election Commission of India for reforms in the RPA, 1951, and the Model Code of Conduct.
The Representation of the People Act, 1951, or RPA 1951, is absolutely fundamental to India's elections. You could call it the operational manual for our democracy. It lays down the entire machinery for conducting elections to parliament and state legislatures.
What are its key provisions that maintain electoral sanctity? How does it keep things clean, so to speak?
It has several crucial elements. Firstly, Section 8 of the Act provides for the disqualification of candidates convicted of certain serious criminal offenses, including heinous crimes, corruption, or electoral offenses like booth capturing. This aims to keep criminals out of politics.
Trying to filter out bad actors.
Exactly. Secondly, Section 123 defines various corrupt practices. This includes things like bribery, exerting undue influence, making appeals to voters based on religion, race, caste, community, or language, or promoting enmity between groups. These provisions are vital for preventing unethical campaign tactics.
So it sets the rules of fair play.
It does, and it also provides the mechanism for dispute resolution through election petitions, allowing election results to be challenged in court if corrupt practices are alleged. So it's significant for disqualifications, defining corrupt practices, and providing remedies.
Okay, it's clearly important. But the Election Commission of India, ECI, feels it needs strengthening. What are the key reforms they are demanding, specifically regarding the RPA and the Model Code of Conduct, MCC?
The ECI has been quite vocal about needing more powers in two key areas. First, concerning the RPA, a major demand is for the power to deregister political parties.
Deregister? They can register parties but not easily remove them.
That's the anomaly. The ECI has the power to register parties, but the process for deregistering them, even if they become defunct or violate regulations, is very cumbersome and legally unclear. The concern is that some registered but inactive parties are allegedly being used as conduits for illegal activities, particularly money laundering, often claiming income tax exemptions associated with political parties. The ECI wants clear power to deregister such entities to clean up the system.
That seems like a major loophole. What's the second reform demand?
The second concerns the Model Code of Conduct, MCC. The MCC is a set of guidelines agreed upon by political parties to ensure ethical conduct during elections. Things like not using government machinery for campaigning, avoiding inflammatory speeches, etc.
Right, we hear about the MCC coming into force before elections.
Yes, but the critical issue is that the MCC is not legally enforceable. It doesn't have statutory backing. It's based on consensus. This means when parties violate the MCC, the ECI's directions or censures are often seen as toothless. They lack legal bite.
So what does the ECI want?
They are demanding statutory backing for the MCC. They want to incorporate its provisions into law, like with the RPA itself, so that violations can attract specific legal penalties,
Yeah.
giving the ECI real enforcement power beyond just naming and shaming.
Making the rules legally binding. That seems crucial. Okay, let's shift from political health to public health, tackling a persistent challenge. Topic 13. Addressing the problem of chronic malnutrition in the country requires nutrition-specific as well as nutrition-sensitive interventions. Analyze.
Chronic malnutrition is a massive public health challenge in India. The statistics are quite stark. The National Family Health Survey, 5, NFHS 5, showed, for instance, that 35.5% of children under 5 are stunted, low height for age, and around 57% of women and young children are anemic. It's a deep-rooted problem.
And the statement says we need two types of interventions, nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive. Let's break that down. What are nutrition-specific interventions?
Nutrition-specific interventions are those that address the immediate causes of malnutrition. They focus directly on the intake of food and nutrients.
What's the main problem they target in the Indian context?
A major issue, as highlighted earlier with the PDS, is the excessive focus on cereals like rice and wheat. This leads to adequate calorie intake for many, but widespread micronutrient deficiencies, lack of essential vitamins and minerals.
So what are the specific interventions here?
These include things like the distribution of fortified foods, for example, rice fortified with iron or milk fortified with vitamins A and D. It also includes providing vitamin and mineral supplements, like iron tablets, especially to vulnerable groups like pregnant women, young children, and tribal communities who may have poor dietary diversity. Direct action on nutrient intake.
Okay, tackling the immediate nutrient gap. Now, what about nutrition-sensitive interventions? How are they different?
Nutrition-sensitive interventions address the underlying causes of malnutrition. They look at broader factors that affect nutritional outcomes, such as health, agriculture, social protection, water, sanitation, and even education.
So it's a wider lens. What's a key problem they address?
One major underlying issue, perhaps surprisingly linked to malnutrition, is the rising problem of obesity and associated non-communicable diseases, NCDs. India now has the third highest number of obese people globally. This double burden of malnutrition, undernutrition, coexisting with overnutrition, obesity, requires sensitive interventions.
How do you intervene sensitively here?
Interventions could include things like additional taxation on unhealthy food products, high in salt, sugar, and unhealthy fats, like high cholesterol products, promoting the use of healthier cooking oils through incentives or awareness campaigns, and implementing clear front-of-pack food labeling, similar to the health advisories we see on tobacco products, warning consumers about unhealthy contents. These measures influence the food environment and consumer choices, indirectly improving nutritional outcomes.
So one tackles the direct lack of nutrients, the other tackles the broader environment and causes. Makes sense. This connects well to local initiatives. Topic 14. Self-help groups, SHGs, are an effective model of social entrepreneurship for women's empowerment and have multiplier effects on developmental processes in rural areas. Elaborate with suitable examples.
Self-help groups, or SHGs, are really powerful force, especially in rural India. Typically, they are small, voluntary associations of people, usually from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, who come together to save small amounts regularly and contribute to a common fund.
Pooling their resources.
Exactly. And critically, these groups are overwhelmingly women-led. They function as mini-banks, providing loans to members from their pooled savings, often for starting small businesses, covering health expenses, or children's education.
How does this relate to social entrepreneurship?
They are a form of social entrepreneurship because they solve a critical market failure. The lack of access to formal credit for the poor, especially women, in rural areas who lack traditional collateral like land titles. SHGs brilliantly use social capital trust, peer pressure, and collective responsibility as collateral. This is innovative. And remarkably, NABARD, National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development data consistently shows credit recovery rates exceeding 98% for SHG loans.
Better than many commercial banks. That's amazing. Can you give a famous example of SHG success scaling up?
The most iconic example, mentioned in the sources, is Lajepapad. It started in 1959 as a small group of women in Mumbai, making pop ads on a rooftop with a borrowed sum of just Rs 80. It grew into a massive women's cooperative, a collective enterprise owned and run by its members, with an annual turnover reaching around 1,600 crores in recent years. It employs thousands of women.
From Rs 80 to 1,600 crore, that's incredible social entrepreneurship. What about the multiplier effects on development?
The impact goes far beyond just the loans or income. When women gain economic security through SHGs, it triggers a cascade of positive effects. They gain confidence, decision-making power within the household increases, and they develop an increased risk appetite to invest in better farming techniques or small enterprises.
So economic empowerment leads to social empowerment.
Absolutely. Better income translates directly into better social outcomes. Improved nutrition for children, reduced infant and maternal mortality rates, IMR/MMR, higher school enrollment, particularly for girls. SHGs often become platforms for discussing health, sanitation, and social issues, contributing to the overall development of the rural community. They build social cohesion and empower women collectively.
A truly transformative model. Okay, moving into our final cluster of topics now, focusing on broader institutional performance and the global future. Let's start with welfare. Topic 15. Success of welfare schemes depends on whether they are built on principles of participation and work within structures of accountability. Discuss.
This question gets to the heart of why some government welfare schemes succeed brilliantly, while others, despite good intentions and significant funding, fall short. The argument is that the two non-negotiable ingredients for success are participation and accountability.
Let's take participation first. How does maximizing participation make a scheme successful?
High participation, especially from the intended beneficiaries in the design and monitoring of schemes, leads to better targeting and ownership. A great example is the use of the Aadhaar biometric ID linked with Jan Dhan bank accounts for direct benefit transfers, DBT, in schemes like PM Kisan, the Farmer Income Support Scheme. This technological integration ensures that the money reaches the intended person directly, reducing leakages and ensuring timely disbursement, which encourages participation because people trust they will receive the benefit.
Technology enabling participation and reducing corruption.
Yes. Another example is the ICDS Poshana Pian, the Integrated Child Development and Nutrition Program. Schemes where local communities, especially mothers groups, are actively involved in monitoring Anganwadi centers tend to show better results in reducing outcomes like child stunting. Conversely, the sources note that relatively slower progress in areas like family planning adoption has sometimes been attributed to issues in ensuring full community participation and addressing social norms.
Okay, so participation is crucial. What happens when the other pillar, accountability, is weak?
Lack of accountability structures is where many schemes falter, leading to poor outcomes and wasted resources. Even if participation is high, if there's no mechanism to hold officials or contractors responsible for delivering quality, the scheme can fail.
Can you give examples of accountability failures?
A stark example mentioned is the issue with poor quality of toilets constructed under the Swachh Bharat mission in some areas. Reports indicated that many toilets were unusable shortly after construction due to substandard materials or lack of water connection, leading people to revert to open defecation. This points to a failure in monitoring construction quality and holding contractors accountable.
So the target was met on paper, but the outcome wasn't achieved.
Precisely. Another example often cited critically is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, MNREGA. While it provides a crucial safety net, it has faced criticism for low productivity of the assets created and allegations of corruption at the local level, sometimes termed the democratization of corruption, where small amounts are siphoned off through fudged muster rolls or inflated costs due to weak monitoring and accountability.
So participation and accountability have to go hand in hand.
Got it. Let's shift focus now to higher education and India's global standing. Topic 16. Why do Indian universities find it difficult to break into the ranks of top global universities? How can Indian institutions of higher education be transformed into global centers of learning?
This is a persistent question. India has a huge higher education system, one of the largest in the world in terms of the number of institutions and students. Yet consistently, Indian universities struggle to feature prominently in the top echelons of global rankings like QS or Times Higher Education.
Why is that? What are the core difficulties holding them back? The sources point to several deep-seated structural problems. Firstly, a chronic faculty shortage. There are significant vacancy rates across the board, even in premier institutions. The example given is a 34% faculty vacancy rate in AIMS, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. You can't achieve global excellence without enough high-quality faculty.
A fundamental resource gap. What else?
Secondly, poor research spending. India's investment in research and development, R&D, is consistently low, hovering around 0.6 to 0.7% of GDP. This pales in comparison to countries like China, around 2.1%, South Korea, where the U.S. world-class universities are built on cutting-edge research, and that requires significant investment.
So lack of teachers and lack of research funds. What about the teaching itself?
That's the third point, an outdated curriculum and pedagogy. There's often an excessive focus on rote learning and memory-based examinations, rather than critical thinking, problem-solving, and practical application. The evaluation systems don't foster innovation.
And connection to the real world.
That's the fourth major weakness, a general lack of strong industry-academia linkage. Universities often operate in isolation from the needs of the economy and industry. Research isn't easily translated into commercial products, and curricula aren't always aligned with the skills employers need.
Okay, those are significant challenges. How can we transform the system? What are the proposed steps?
Well, addressing those weaknesses directly. First, significantly increase R&D spending, aiming for global benchmarks. Second, fundamentally overhaul the examination and evaluation system. Move away from rote memorization towards application-based project work, presentations, and continuous assessment that fosters deeper learning.
Changing how we teach and test.
Exactly. Third, actively create platforms and incentives for collaboration between industry, especially MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises, and universities. This could involve joint research projects, internships, and curriculum development.
Bridging that gap.
Yes. And finally, there needs to be a greater focus on ensuring graduates find employment in their core fields of study. We need to prevent the significant skill mismatch and wastage, where, for example, a qualified civil engineer ends up working as a generic management trainee because relevant jobs aren't available, or the linkages aren't there. Creating high-quality jobs aligned with education is part of transforming universities into engines of growth.
A holistic approach needed there. Now let's zoom out to the global level and look at international institutions. Topic 17. The second decade of the 21st century marks a collective failure of the UN and its agencies. Examine the statement citing suitable examples.
That's a strong statement, claiming a collective failure.
Yeah.
We need to acknowledge that the UN has had significant successes in the past, playing a role in decolonization, setting global norms, coordinating humanitarian aid, and establishing frameworks like the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs.
So it's not all negative, but the question focuses on recent failures, particularly in the second decade, 2010-2020 onwards. What evidence supports this view?
The evidence points to significant shortcomings in key areas. Firstly, the UN's core mandate. maintaining international peace and security. Here, its inability to broker peace or prevent major conflicts, especially those involving its powerful P5 members, the permanent members of the Security Council, US, UK, France, Russia, China, is stark. Think of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the Security Council was paralyzed by Russia's veto, or the inability to prevent US-led invasions in the past.
The P5 veto power being a major obstacle.
A fundamental one. Secondly, the performance of its specialized agencies has come under fire. The World Health Organization, WHO, faced heavy criticism for its perceived delay in declaring COVID-19 a global pandemic and subsequent struggles in ensuring global vaccine equity. This eroded trust in a key global health agency.
The pandemic really exposed some weaknesses. What about other areas like climate change?
Climate justice is another area cited as a failure. There's been a dilution of the core principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR.
Can you quickly remind us what CBDR means?
Certainly. CBDR is the principle agreed under the UN climate framework that acknowledges that while all countries share the responsibility to tackle climate change, richer, industrialized nations, which historically contributed most to the problem, have a greater responsibility, differentiated responsibility, to lead emission cuts and provide financial and technological support to developing nations.
And this principle is being weakened.
Yes, there's a push towards more uniform expectations, lessening the burden on developed countries. Added to this is the failure of the West to deliver on its promise made in the Paris Agreement to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 to help developing countries adapt to climate change. This funding gap represents a major failure in climate justice and global cooperation.
And security issues beyond major wars.
Even on critical security issues like terrorism, the UN has struggled. There is still no globally agreed consensus on the very definition of terrorism, which hinders coordinated international action against terrorist groups, often due to political disagreements among member states.
So peace and security, health, climate, terrorism failures across the board. What's the conclusion?
The conclusion drawn is that the UN's current structure, particularly the dominance of the P5 and outdated power dynamics, is preventing it from effectively addressing 21st century challenges. This fuels the growing call for fundamental reformed multilateralism, a push to update global institutions to reflect current realities.
Reformed multilateralism. We'll come back to that. Let's focus now on a key regional grouping for India. Topic 18. ASEAN is not only important for the development of the Northeast, but also it remains India's gateway to East Asia and beyond. Discuss.
ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is absolutely central to India's foreign policy, particularly its Act East policy. This relationship leverages the geographical proximity between India, especially its northeastern states, and Southeast Asia.
How does ASEAN act as India's gateway to East Asia?
In several ways. Firstly, through physical connectivity. Major infrastructure projects like the India-Myanmar-Thailand Trilateral Highway aim to directly link India's landmass with Southeast Asia, facilitating trade and movement. Secondly, economically, countries like Singapore are used by Indian businesses as crucial logistics hubs and financial centers to access the wider East Asian market.
So, roads and hubs. What about broader partnerships?
Yes, initiatives like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPF, which includes several ASEAN members, provide platforms for economic partnership. Strategically, cooperation with ASEAN countries is vital for India in managing its relationship with China and promoting a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region.
Okay, that's the gateway aspect. How is ASEAN important specifically for the development of India's Northeast?
Enhanced connectivity and trade with ASEAN are seen as crucial for unlocking the economic potential of India's landlocked northeastern states. Better road, rail, and potentially riverine links would allow goods and services from the Northeast to reach Southeast Asian markets more easily, boosting local economies and creating jobs. Cultural and people-to-people ties are also strong.
It sounds promising, but what are the key challenges in this relationship? What limits India's ability to fully leverage ASEAN?
There are significant challenges. One major issue is internal divisions within ASEAN itself. The group is often split, particularly regarding China, with some members having closer ties to Beijing, pro-China camp, and others being more wary, anti-China camp. This makes it difficult for ASEAN to take unified stances and limits India's ability to engage with the bloc as a cohesive strategic partner.
So ASEAN isn't always on the same page?
Not always, no. Another serious challenge, particularly for the Northeast, is the security risk emanating from the region, specifically the infamous Golden Triangle area overlapping Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. This area is a major hub for drug smuggling and illicit activities, which often fuels insurgency and instability in India's bordering northeastern states.
A direct security spillover.
Yes. And overall, China's significant economic and political influence across Southeast Asia inevitably limits India's strategic space and presents a constant competitive dynamic for India within the region.
A complex balancing act, then. This brings us to a new framework designed partly to address that influence. Topic 19. The USA-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, IPEF, is an economic initiative to complement its existing security partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region. Analyze the significance of and challenges to IPEF in the present scenario.
Right, the IPEF. Launched by the U.S. in 2022, it involves 14 countries in the Indo-Pacific region, including India, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and several Asian members. It's structured around 4 pillars: trade, supply chains, clean energy infrastructure, and tax anti-corruption.
What is its main significance? Why was it launched?
Its significance is multi-layered. Firstly, it's widely seen as a strategic move by the U.S. to offer an alternative economic vision to China's growing influence, particularly its massive Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. The BRI has been criticized for its checkbook diplomacy and for creating potential debt traps for recipient countries, like the well-known case of Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. IPF aims to offer a more transparent, sustainable model.
An alternative to BRI. What else?
Secondly, IPF strongly promotes the concept of friendshoring or ally shoring. This represents a shift in thinking about globalization, moving away from purely seeking economic efficiency, lowest cost, towards building more resilient and secure supply chains among trusted partners who share common values, primarily democratic ones.
Prioritizing security and values over just cost.
Exactly. It's about de-risking supply chains from potential disruptions or geopolitical coercion. Thirdly, IPF is seen as the economic complement to existing security alliances in the region, most notably the Quad, US, India, Japan, Australia. The Quad focuses on security cooperation. IPF aims to add the economic dimension to strengthen that partnership.
Okay, significant goals. But what are the challenges facing IPF? Why might it struggle to achieve these aims?
There are several major challenges. One is the practical difficulty for many member countries, including those in ASEAN, to significantly decouple their economies from China. China is simply too large a trading partner and investor for many to easily reduce dependence, even if they desire alternatives.
The economic entanglement is deep.
Very deep. Another challenge is a certain lack of clarity around the specific commitments and benefits IPF will offer, especially compared to traditional free trade agreements, which usually involve tariff reductions, which IPF largely avoids.
And for countries like India.
A key concern for developing countries, including India, is that some aspects of IPF, particularly under the trade pillar, propose very high standards, sometimes called WTO plus standards, on issues like digital trade, labor rights, and environmental regulations. Meeting these ambitious standards could be difficult and costly for developing economies, potentially limiting their ability to fully participate or benefit. India, in fact, opted out of the trade pillar initially due to these concerns.
High standards potentially being a barrier. Okay, let's move to our final topic, which brings us back to the theme of reformed multilateralism, but through a different lens. Topic 20. BRICS has the potential to lead the path towards reformed multilateralism, but suffers from numerous internal contradictions. Discuss.
BRICS, the grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and recently expanded, is a significant force in the global economy. Together, the original five represent about 24% of global GDP and 42% of the world's population.
And its potential for reformed multilateralism, where does that come from?
Its potential stems from its nature as a grouping of major non-Western economies. It implicitly challenges the dominance of the traditional Bretton Woods institutions, like the World Bank and IMF, which are often seen as reflecting Western interests and hierarchies. BRICS operates, at least in principle, on a basis of equality among members, with no formal hierarchy.
What concrete initiatives demonstrate this potential?
The most significant achievements are the creation of the New Development Bank, NDB, headquartered in Shanghai, and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, CRA. The NDB provides funding for infrastructure projects in member countries and other emerging economies, crucially with equal voting rights for the founding members. Unlike the weighted voting in the World Bank EMF, the CRA is a financial safety net, a pool of reserves members can draw upon unconditionally in case of balance of payments, BOP crises, offering an alternative to the often conditional loans from the IMF.
So creating alternative institutions based on equality. But the question highlights internal contradictions. What are they?
Despite the potential, BRICS is plagued by deep internal contradictions that severely limit its effectiveness and cohesion. Firstly, there's a fundamental lack of common ideology or political system. You have large democracies like India, Brazil, and South Africa, grouped with authoritarian states like China and Russia. This makes aligning on global governance norms inherently difficult.
Democracies and autocracies in the same club.
Exactly. Secondly, related to this, there's a significant trust deficit stemming from major bilateral conflicts between members. The most glaring example is the ongoing India-China border dispute, which involves military standoffs and deep strategic mistrust. You also see instances like Brazil voting against Russia at the UN on resolutions concerning Ukraine, highlighting divergent foreign policy stances.
Bilateral problems spilling over.
Yes, and this leads to the third contradiction: bilateral issues hijacking the group's agenda. A prime example is China repeatedly using its influence within BRICS-related forums, like placing technical holds at the UN Security Council's 1267 committee to block the designation of Pakistan-based terrorists, despite consensus from other members like India. This undermines the group's credibility on shared security concerns.
Using the group for individual agendas.
Precisely. And finally, despite the talk of economic cooperation, intra-BRICS trade remains relatively low compared to their trade with countries outside the bloc. The economic integration hasn't lived up to the initial hype.
So what's the overall conclusion for BRICS?
The conclusion is that while BRICS holds symbolic importance and has created useful institutions like the NDB, it needs to effectively address and resolve these deep-seated internal conflicts and contradictions if it truly hopes to lead the way towards a genuinely reformed and more equitable global development architecture. The potential is there, but the internal divisions are a major stumbling block.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground, 20 distinct, complex topics. To help all of us, and especially you listening, lock this in, let's do a rapid-fire recap of the absolute core takeaways. Ready?
Let's do it. Active recall time. Okay, starting with governance. The CAG's key limitation is its post-mortem analysis. For NGOs, overcoming the trust deficit requires practical steps like a single window engagement.
Subsidies have become populist, using tools like free electricity for the well-off, undermining development. The NCST, while important, is hampered because it has no real power to enforce its findings.
We argued that normalizing poverty overshadows institutional failure, with China lifting 850 million out of poverty as a key counterexample. Manual scavenging persists due to caste realities, often being the only job available for those trapped in it.
On the world stage, India's Ukraine response showed strategic autonomy, prioritizing national interests like cheaper oil over aligning with blocs. Soft power is valuable, creating long-term influence, but it can't replace hard power needed for deterrence.
The India-Japan relationship, despite shared values, faces challenges of Seikei-Bunri limiting economic ambition, though Japan's ODA remains crucial. India's West Asia ties have deepened beyond oil, marked by new partnerships like the I2U2 Minilateral.
Back home, unlocking public data requires a clear data protection law. The Election Commission urgently needs the power to deregister parties and give statutory backing to the Model Code of Conduct.
We distinguished chronic malnutrition interventions, nutrition-specific like fortified rice milk for immediate gaps, and nutrition-sensitive like taxing high cholesterol products for underlying causes. SHEs exemplify social entrepreneurship, using social capital as collateral, proven by Lijat Papad's massive success.
Welfare scheme success hinges on participation and accountability. Failures lead to outcomes like poor quality toilets under Swachh Bharat or M. Energy's democratization of corruption. Indian universities struggle due to faculty shortages, low R&D spend, and rote learning.
Globally, the UN faces criticism for failures like the P5's inability to broker peace and delays in the COVID response. ISAN is India's gateway east, but challenged by internal divisions and the Golden Triangle security risk. The U.S.-led IP promotes friendshoring, but faces challenges like decoupling from China at its high WTO plus standards.
And finally, BRICS' potential for reformed multilateralism via the NDB is undercut by internal contradictions like the lack of common ideology, the India-China border dispute, and bilateral hijacking of agendas.
Phew, that covers the core points. Now, bringing these domestic and global threads together, here's a final thought to consider. We've seen how global frameworks like IPF are explicitly shifting focus from pure economic efficiency towards prioritizing security and shared values, this idea of friendshoring.
Right, a big shift in global strategy.
So the question for you to mull over is this. If the global stage is fundamentally revaluing security and partnerships over just cost, how drastically must our domestic economic policies, things like how we allocate subsidies, how we fund university research, how we build infrastructure change right now to align with this new geopolitical reality? How does friendshoring translate back home?
That's a fascinating question about aligning domestic priorities with a changing world order. Plenty to think about there. Thank you so much for guiding us through this incredibly dense but vital material today.
My pleasure. It's crucial knowledge for navigating the complexities ahead.
And thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it was insightful. We'll see you next time.